Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershift, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today is episode 3 in our 3-part series on the election season special. And this episode is going to be about the incumbency advantage. Now, Bill could not make it to this episode, so Zach is joining me today. It's just me and Zach.
Zach and I, you mean?
What's up?
I said Zach and I, you mean?
Sure. Zach and I.
I'm trying to channel my inner Bill,
okay.
so I figured he corrects you a lot.
I appreciate that. Make sure if you really want to channel your inner Bill, make sure you go on rants during this episode that most people don't agree with, because that's Bill's specialty.
Okay.
And getting really worked up about things that are not a big deal.
I don't think anybody really enjoys listening to me, so I think that will pretty much, I can fill in well for Bill then.
All right, sounds good. Sorry if this episode is being dropped a little late. It should be right before the election. My wife was out of town all week, and then we got a COVID scare at my kid's school. So I had to do work and daddy duty for about 5 days, and it obviously pushed the recording of this podcast back. But we're getting it out now. We have an election on the horizon, Zach. And
yeah, did you know?
Yeah, not sure if you've heard about it, but it's a pretty big deal. And we're recording this on Friday night, October 30th. So it is
like 5
4 days before the election, four-ish days before the election. And whenever you're listening to this, hopefully you listen to it before the election or after. God, who knows? Who knows how long it'll take to get the votes counted for it to all get figured out. Either way, whether Trump or Biden wins, it won't become official till the 3rd week of January. So in the end, there's plenty of time. But in this episode, we're going to be focusing on the incumbency advantage. And this is something that I really pushed Bill when he came up with this idea of doing this election season special series. I really pushed Bill on this episode, the incumbency advantage, because I was actually, when I first started teaching government and politics, I was a little bit surprised at how big of a deal this was, to be honest with you. And I wanted to bring it up to you, the listeners, and so you could at least have an idea of just how big of a role this plays, because I hadn't really thought about it up to this point. So you may be asking, Chris, what is the incumbency advantage? And this is the idea that the person, man or woman, who is currently in their role has an advantage in their attempt for re-election. Now, over the last century, so past 100 years, the incumbent who ran for re-election in the presidency has won 80% of the time. And in fact, so think about that, 80% of the time, the president running for re-election over the last 100 years has won. And in fact, in Congress, so in the Senate and House of Representatives, it's happened at an even higher rate. Now, over the last 40 years, it's happened twice. And it happened in 1992 when Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush. And it happened in 1980 when Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter. Now, Reagan being Carter, we can get into the Iran hostage situation and all that stuff, which we won't in this episode. But I do want to point out in 1992, Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush, but there was a third party candidate in Ross Perot who took up almost 20% of the vote. And you can go back and forth on who he took more of the votes from, Clinton or Bush. And honestly, no one will ever know. But many political analysts and historians would argue that Ross Perot likely took more of the vote from George H.W. Bush, which would mean, if you extrapolate it out, if Ross Perot never ran, George H.W. Bush likely would have won re-election, even with a couple big issues staring him in the face. So there's a very good chance if Ross Perot had not run for president, we might be talking about only one time in the last 40 years this has actually happened. Zach?
Yeah, and typically when it has happened, there's been some type of economic issue that's occurring. So in the 80s, there was the oil embargo, which caused a stagflation crisis, which was not to get too much into economic history, but basically there wasn't a lot of growth, but there was high inflation. And then in the 1930s, there was this little thing called the Great Depression. That was when Herbert Hoover lost his reelection campaign to FDR.
Yeah, that was it. And that's going back. I mean, that's going
years.
way back. But I think that's a good point because, like, even that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and over the last century, like I mentioned, 80% of the time, and that's one of the few times that the incumbent did not win. So we have Clinton, we have Carter, we have Hoover, obviously, and there was always some huge economic issue. So when it came to like other ancillary issues or seemingly less important issues, the incumbent has pretty much always been able to rise above them. And like I mentioned, we'll get to these in more detail when we get to them in the narrative. We're not going to dive in detail about the FDR Hoover election or the Reagan Carter or the Clinton George H.W. Bush. But I did think it was valuable for us to spend some time thinking about why. Like, why does the incumbent have such a huge advantage? I mean, you have to, as an incumbent running for Congress or for president, really mess up in order to lose. Statistically. I mean, this is not me editorializing on any specific candidate. Statistically, you have to be you have to be very poor at communicating your reelection message, or you will have had to have really messed up during your term in order to not win reelection. And that's important to note because, you know, when historians look back at this stuff, they recognize how important or how big of a deal certain things are to the American public. And when you lose a re-election, that is a referendum on your competency and your effectiveness in that role, more than anything else. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why it's such a big referendum because of all the advantages that are built into being an incumbent. So let's just dive right into them. Let's not waste time. Number one, and we're going to focus on the president here for the first 9 advantages. There are a lot of advantages. We'll focus on the president for the first 9. Number one, they're already president. So they have a lot of name recognition. And you may say, well, duh, Chris. Of course they're already president. That's actually a really big deal. Because for 4 years, they will be able to get their name out there. They'll be on TV. They'll be in the papers and in the online newspapers and on the internet for the next 4 years all over the world. You know, the American president is seen as one of, if not the most powerful person in the entire world. So that name recognition is critical. And if you really study politics, you will find out, especially on the local level, name recognition more than anything else drive who people vote for. I actually, yeah, Zach.
As an anecdote for the power of name recognition, I remember that there was a candidate who won, and he was a challenger, but his name was Jesse James. And Jesse James is a famous, Western criminal, and a lot of people were just like, "Oh, Jesse James, I know that name," and right, they
Yeah,
would
that's
check
a
it.
sweet name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that name. Yeah.
So, and there's often, especially at local level elections, oftentimes a strong name or a recognizable name will really break through.
Oh, big time. I mean, look at the Kennedy family. In Maryland, there's a family in Maryland,
Or for
the Sarbanes.
people in Texas, the Bush family.
Yep, the Bush family. In Maryland, on the local level, there's a family, the Sarbanes family.
Mayor Carcetti.
John, yeah.
It's a Wire
If you're a
reference.
fan of The Wire, you would pick up
What's
on
his
that.
actual name?
O'Malley.
The O'Malley family.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah, Carcetti in The Wire was based off of O'Malley. I'm not going to say the accuracy of that depiction, but yeah, it was based off O'Malley. But the Sarbanes family, John Sarbanes has been a member of the House for a long time, and I believe if his brother, his cousin, is a judge on the Eastern Shore. But name recognition's huge. Name recognition's big to the point where I knew someone personally who ran for office who put like their profile on half of their billboard and then their name on the other half. And I had a political strategist tell me, like, that's really dumb. They should take their face off the billboard and just put their name on the whole thing. And I said, why? And they said, because the only thing that matters is the name. If people recognize the name, that's all that matters. They don't need to know what you look like. And I thought that was interesting. Not saying that political strategist was absolutely correct, but I hadn't really thought about it like that. All right, so let's go on to reason number 2. Incumbents have the advantage. They've had years in the national spotlight, and that seems pretty obvious, and it also sort of goes along with number 1, but it's a big deal, right? Going back over 100 years ago now with Teddy Roosevelt, who established this concept of the bully pulpit. This idea that if you're president, you are actually the most powerful person in the world. And you can use that pulpit, so to speak, this platform to make public announcements and to divert legislation one way or the other. And that also comes in hand, of course, with foreign relations, too.
Yeah, I mean, the president has the ability to kind of drive the narrative, even going back in a long time, just because they're the chief executive of the country, because it's the highest office in the land, because it actually almost has this mythos standing in American identity, right? The people on our money are presidents, right? They aren't like, isn't Neil
Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, Mount Rushmore.
Presidents.
It's not Neil Armstrong. It's not like
there's no Harriet Tubman on Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, it's not the guy who invented peanut butter. It's not the Wright brothers. It's our presidents. Right?
Guy who invented peanut butter.
It's so it has a very important thing. So it's ingrained in our American psychology that the president has authority. So when the president is talking about an issue, historically that issue has come to the forefront of the American identity and it has driven our political culture. So when a president is running for re-election, oftentimes they're the ones who are setting the agenda, or their identity is setting the agenda of the debate within the electorate.
Yeah. Yeah, and without getting into the value of the guy who actually invented peanut butter, I would agree with you there. And now,
hey, peanut butter is like an amazing invention, and we really do not talk enough about like how awesome peanut butter is. So I'm here to like preach the good gospel of the peanut butter.
Yeah, as someone who makes lunches for their kids' school the next day, if I did not have bread and peanut butter, I don't know what I do every day. Because the night before it would totally stress me out with what I'm going to make for lunch the next day. But anyway, that's the story for another day. Now, in addition to this idea of like just having the pulpit in general, because you're the president of the United States, you have built-in opportunities too, like the State of the Union. Now, the State of the Union used to be an address that was written down and just delivered to Congress. Not anymore. Now it is a huge deal. in which it is delivered verbally to Congress. It's a speech they've delivered from the president, and it is more or less just a speech of the president saying all the great things he's done and gain a standing ovation every 35 seconds for it. And it's exhausting to watch. I recommend you not actually watch it and just read about it the next day from an unbiased source. But you have that every year. You have press briefings. You have an actual press secretary whose full-time job is to spin the news your way. Like, that is their full-time job, is to answer questions, but make sure that they do it in a way that is favorable to you. Like, that's pretty awesome to have someone who does that all day, every day for 4 years.
And that press secretary, when they talk, is viewed as significant news for the news media.
Yeah.
Right. So a press secretary is able to intervene and create news in a way that a challenger's campaign spokesperson has just not been able to do. Now, things are a little bit different this election year just because there's so much news so fast in the pandemic. But historically, that's been the case.
Yeah, and we'll see the power of the press secretary if it changes over time with the internet and the just incredible amount of available news sources on the internet. You also have special sessions of Congress. You have foreign engagements, right? Like any type of foreign pacts you make or economic deals. Or
just state
like
dinners, right? Just doing a state dinner.
State dinners. Like if you help negotiate an alliance between two countries that were warring at the time, so to speak, whatever it is, like all of these opportunities to get your name in the press in a positive light.
Americans love the Queen. If you get to host the Queen for a state dinner, right? We love our British gossip.
Yep. I mean, you can just like basically throw like formal networking events and then good things happen and you can pose that things are happening, even if things really aren't happening. And then lastly, like you run, right? You're running for re-election. You have that national spotlight. And oftentimes, I would say, at least lately, the lines have been blurred a bit in the 21st century between the campaign and the actual White House staff. And there has been some rollover. So traditionally, if you're on the White House staff, you do not operate in the campaign. It's totally separate. It's the Hatch Act, everything else. You can't use the White House. You can't use Washington, D.C. You can't use your role as the president to help promote you as a candidate for president. It just can't be done. It's illegal. But there's been a lot of gray area recently. And so that has allowed incumbent presidents, especially notably recently President Trump, to really take advantage of that gray area and allow them to influence their campaign in some way with staff that they currently have full-time on the payroll in the White House. It's a big advantage. So this national spotlight is huge. The third one, experience. They have the experience. People don't like change. People are afraid of change. They like people that have experience because it's sort of like, I'd rather the devil I know than the devil I don't. And as silly as that sounds sometimes to people, that is very real. That is very real. And if you're able to show that you can be competent or effective in a handful of areas in your role, then people, especially if they reflect on the last 4 years, they'll recognize, like, yeah, it hasn't been that bad. Like, what's the worst that could happen if he or she, hopefully one day, has 4 more years? Number 4, they're experienced campaigners. So the fourth advantage to an incumbent is the fact that they've already won one time. They've already been through a campaign. They learned what worked, what didn't work. What states did I go to that really, changed the outcome of that state? What states did I go to that didn't really change much of anything? what areas of the country did I think would be impacted by me going there or me sending a certain message that when we looked at the results really didn't. Right? They've already been through the process. They've already campaigned. They've already seen the vote results, and they've already been able to analyze all of the results. Now, naturally, 4 years later, nothing will be exactly the same. But that's a huge advantage going into a campaigning season to know exactly how these are the five major messages I tried to deliver. This is how they were received. This is where they were received well, where they weren't received well, what areas of the country I went to that really made a difference, what areas of the country I went to that didn't, etc. That's a huge strategic advantage to have that data and to have that experience.
Yeah, and I would also say that because they're the chief executive, they're able to essentially invest resources in critical constituencies. And since our political parties are
Hmm.
basically coalitions that are established before the election, those participants of those coalitions tend to be rewarded by those first 4 years that the president had in their first term. So oftentimes when they're running on re-election, it's reaffirming the bonds of the coalition. So
Yeah.
as like an anecdote I can think of, being from Ohio, I remember that there were three military bases that were supposed to be closed between George W. Bush's first term and second term, I want to say. I might have the dates wrong, but they ended up not closing them, whereas they closed one in North Dakota or South Dakota, whichever one with Tom Daschle, who was a Democrat and who was a senator leader at the time for the Democrats. So that's an example of how the incumbent president can basically, I don't want to say put favorites, but can reward members of his constituency and his coalition. Traditionally, it hasn't. The president has still also tried to be president for the whole country and not just basically be like, well, these people voted for me, so therefore they're going to get the goodies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think that traditionally the United States of America's president has acted in that way. That if they're the president for everyone, not just those
Yeah,
who
and
support
there's been
them.
periods where that's not been the case. I would just like to
Yep,
stress
for
that,
sure.
like, as an example, the press went white America went completely crazy when Teddy Roosevelt had Booker T. Washington to the White House, and it was a giant
Hmm.
scandal. So that would be an example where uh, uh, the president, through popular outrage, could not be the president for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are other examples we could get into that we're not going to in this episode. But for sure, you could pick out many examples from many different presidents in which they don't operate in that way. But yeah, I love that Teddy Roosevelt example. Now, reason number 5 incumbent presidents have an advantage: patriotism. People feel a sense of loyalty to the president. Now, if the reelection is during a time of crisis, especially one in which a foreign nation is involved, that can really, really help them. Obviously, with Carter and Reagan, we saw that sort of backfire on Carter because of his inability to handle the seeming inability to handle the crisis. But patriotism is a huge deal, right? Like most Americans love being American and they want to find a way to love their president. And so if the incumbent president can give them any reason, like real good reason that they can hang on to love them and support them, they will. Number 6, they have an existing support base. Obviously, from winning the first time, there is at least 45% of the population that voted for them once already. When you think about the social consistency principle within people in general and social psychology, people are going to be more apt, those 45% people are going to be more apt to want to vote for that person again. They don't want to be seen as contradictory or, I remember when Kerry ran, it was like a huge deal that he was a flip flopper on the war in Iraq. And And I remember thinking, like, for one reason or another, like, politics aside, like, is it really that bad to change your opinion when facts change or when things change? Um, but that idea of being a flip-flopper, of someone who changes their ideas, changes their principles, changes their stances on things, is incredibly damaging in American and international politics. So, if you already have an existing support base of millions of people who already went to the polls and voted for you, it's going to really play um, a large role in your reelection campaign. Number 7, voter risk aversion. I mentioned this a little bit when I talked about the experience of a president in number 3, but people don't like change. People really don't like change. And if things get too bad, people are willing to deal with like any change because anything could be better than this guy. But for the most part, people don't like change. They're afraid of change. And if you're an incumbent, you can run so effectively by fear mongering change because change can be as bad as you're able to articulate it. So, a lot of voters recognize, well, if the last 4 years haven't been that bad, or maybe been a little bad, but not too bad, or have been great even, then why would I consider voting for someone else who could come in and mess it all up and totally change the direction of my career and or my life? So that's number 7, voter risk aversion. Number 8, money. It's all about the Benjamins. And in politics, it is a lot about the Benjamins. For example, President Trump, when he first became president in 2017, he began raising money for his reelection in 2020. Now, I want to be very clear. This is not unique. Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush, they all did it. And that's because if you're the president, you are the presumed representative of that party. So when Donald Trump becomes president, election of 2016, was inaugurated in 2017, of course, unless something happens to him physically, like he can't continue, or something catastrophic were to happen in which he would need to resign or choose not to run for re-election like LBJ, the assumption is he's going to run for re-election. So the moment he becomes president, he becomes by far the most likely candidate to win the Republican ticket in 2020. Well, someone like former Vice President Joe Biden or Senator Kamala Harris, even, or Senator Cory Booker or Mayor Pete Buttigieg or some of the other Democratic
The
candidates,
dozens and
Senator
dozens of
Bernie
candidates there
Sanders,
were
right?
this year.
Dozens of dozens. I could go on and on. Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Who
I
is the
could go
guy
on
from
and on and on.
Colorado? I can't remember his name.
Put me on the spot. Hickenlooper?
Yeah, I think Hickenlooper. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's running for Senate.
Oh yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
that's right. I think I'm thinking of the
Against Cory
Starbucks
Gardner.
guy.
Oh, yeah, he didn't run for the
He didn't actually run. He tried to.
He did not. No, well, he did not run for the Democratic ticket. He was going to run as an independent.
And then he backed out. Yeah.
Yeah, and then everybody yelled at him, so he backed out. But anyway, Howard Schultz. Yeah, he just sort of floated that out there, and then that didn't go over so well. But anyway, where was I? Money raised, right? So if you're that candidate, you can start raising money right away. Like I mentioned, President Trump began raising money in 2017. He has been raising money for his reelection for 4 years, 3.5 years. 3.5 years. When someone like former Vice President Joe Biden has not had that same opportunity. So a couple facts from the Congress side that really speak to how important this is. Over 88% of the House candidates and 82% of the Senate candidates who raised the most money over the last 50 years have won re-election. In the 2018 Senate race, the incumbents outraised their challengers by an average of 15.5 million to 2.8 million. So the amount of money you can raise if you're already in the seat is astronomical to the amount of money you can raise if you're a challenger.
And I would also interject there that the incumbency advantage also goes down to the primary level as well. So the incumbents are able to raise more money, they have more name recognition. So it's not just that that is valuable when facing against a challenger from the opposite party, but it is also valuable in facing a challenger in the primary from within their party. And this year was a historic year for incumbents to lose in the primary, and it was still like only like 10. It was a very low number when you would think of it. I mean, for it being historical.
Yeah, and I would also say that when you're a current congressman, not as much president, but it probably happens more in Congress. When you're a current congressman, you can make sure that you negotiate situations in which you will not have a heavily funded primary challenger. That happens a lot, and that's something maybe we'll dive into in another episode, but that happens a lot. All right, last one. Last presidential incumbent advantage, number 9, they can point to a record. Now, I would couch this by saying that could be an advantage or it could not be an advantage. George W. Bush in 2004 found out that his record, post 9/11, everything was going great, but over the next 2 years, 2.5 years, things didn't go so great.
I wouldn't say it was going great, but
yeah, well, I mean, his approval rating was insanely high.
His approval rating was very high.
That's what I meant by going great. Look, man, when you're look, Zach, when you're a politician, the approval rating is how good things are going. Okay.
I would just say that if any of our listeners are younger,
we don't have to go down that
post
rabbit hole.
9/11 was like a very scary time.
I would agree.
Had a lot of trauma.
I would agree. I'm not trying to like sugarcoat it or like whitewash it. Trust me, I was alive for it. But from a political perspective, things were going great. But over time, over the next couple years, things didn't go so great. And so while oftentimes you can point to your record, sometimes that can be a real advantage or it can't be an advantage. But if you're a good enough politician, you can phrase it in a way where the only things you ever talk about in your record are the things you did. And there's real opportunity for you to do just like trivial or token things as a president, executive orders or easy pieces of legislation to pass where you're doing this so you can bring it up a year later or 2 years later in your reelection campaign to appeal to a certain demographic in the population. Whether or not you actually cared about it or whether or not it was actually effective is a different story. But you can say, hey, I led the charge to pass X law, and that helps you in theory. Because most people don't know whether or not it actually did impact them positively or negatively. So, that's it. Those are the 9 presidential incumbent advantages. Number 1, they're already president. Number 2, they've had years in the spotlight. Number 3, they have experience. Number 4, they're experienced campaigners. Number 5, people are patriotism. Number 6, they have an existing support base. Number 7, voter risk aversion. Number 8, they are able to raise a whole bunch of money. Number 9, they can point to a record. Now, there are a couple advantages that most people apply to congressmen, congresswomen, congresspeople, whatever, you know what I mean, that I think you can also apply to presidential candidates. The first one is this concept of pork barrel spending. And pork barrel spending, without really getting into it, the phrase came from like the 1860s and the Civil War. This idea of feeding salted pork to slaves and that if you're able to get the pork barrel or the pork that is in your favor. So
pork was very, very popular at the time.
yeah,
America, we like to think of ourselves as beef eaters, but during the 1860s, most Americans ate a huge quantity of pork. And when we get to the Civil War, I'll talk about why that was so important in Western Tennessee.
good. Can't wait. Can't wait. I've been actually chomping at the bit to dive deeper into the pork obsession in Western Tennessee in the 1860s. So it's going to be great. It's going to be great.
Not quite where I'm going with it, but it's a fun bit of information from a broader. Anyways,
Sounds
you
good.
know how much I read about the Civil War.
Yeah,
Civil War
a lot, and that's why you're on the podcast. Yeah, because you read a lot about this stuff. Now, pork barrel spending is basically when a congressman, congressperson, whatever, man or woman, you know what I mean. A congressman negotiates some type of favorable piece of legislation for their constituents that might be viewed in other parts of the country as superfluous spending. But it really helps the people who are going to vote to reelect them. So the idea, the criticism behind it is if you get a whole bunch of congressmen every time a big bill comes up saying like, hey, throw in 20 million for this and throw in 15 million for this and throw in 30 million for this, then you have a whole bunch of money going all over the country for very specific reasons for all these different congressmen who are trying to get reelected. Now, you can do that to a certain extent as a president too, with executive orders. You can pass executive orders that appeal to a specific group of voters. And sometimes presidents pass executive orders that have no real legal basis at all. And they know will be challenged in the courts or never take effect. But they do it just for the publicity of saying, hey, this demographic, look at this executive order I'm passing just to benefit you. And then they can come back to it when they run for reelection, right? We also have franking. So congressional representatives are able to send out mail. And that mail can tell people like what's going on in the community, what's going on in the state, like where they can vote. You also have a budget as a new congressman to send out mail, like introducing yourself to your constituents. Like that's a huge advantage. You don't have to pay for that. The government pays for that. Now, normally that's just a congressional advantage, but being that we just went through COVID, we're still in COVID right now, the COVID crisis as we enter November of 2020. I remember getting a COVID check in the mail with President Trump's signature on it. Now, that isn't traditional, and the Treasury Department had some things to say about that, but technically he could do that, and that was under his purview. And I would assume that didn't hurt him to be signing his name on checks that Congress allocated taxpayer dollars to pay people. His signature, I'm sure, helped him in some households. And then lastly, PAC donations. So PAC donations are political action committees. These are groups that basically can advertise for a specific candidate, but not technically advertising for the candidate. There are a couple loopholes they can jump through in which they don't violate the rules around how much you can donate to a candidate. And these PAC donations are often much larger when the people making the donations are confident that the person they're donating to will win. So when you're the incumbent, you have all of these advantages I've talked about, and then these statistical advantages you can point to. People are going to be much more likely to donate to you, knowing that if they donate $10 million to a winner, they may be able to get something out of that. Whereas if they donate $10 million to a loser, then that's $10 million down the drain. And lastly, if we wrap up this episode on the incumbency advantage, I know I've thrown a lot at you in this episode, but I do think it's important if we have an election coming up. There are two congressional advantages that I recognize that don't apply to the president. Number one, congressmen have a staff that can really help constituents in their district or in their state solve very real problems. I'm not sure you can really say that about the president, if they represent the entire country. But that can really help. If you're a constituent, you call into your representative's office or your senator's office and you have a very real problem and they help you with it, that goes a long way toward earning their vote for the next time around.
So something that happened with the COVID crisis is that congressmen were able to help small businesses and individuals navigate the federal bureaucracy for getting the COVID relief funds. That would be an example that a challenger couldn't do.
I remember about 10 years ago when I bought my first house, there's some type of issue because it was going through a government program. I was a teacher at the time and I was using like government program to help purchase this house for a discount, whatever. And I remember there's an issue with it. I can't remember exactly what the issue was, but I called my local representative's office and told him like, hey, I'm a constituent of yours. This is a problem I'm running into. I don't know what to do. You're my local rep. Can you please help me? No joke. He took care of it within like 2 days and it was all done. Like there was no more problem. And I was like, wow. Okay, I'm voting for you for reelection. Like, I don't care what party you are. I don't care what your ideology is. Like, you just helped me buy this house, dude. You earned another voter. That was 10 years ago. I no longer live in that district, so I can't remember exactly who it was. But I voted for him. Like, I remember going in and voting for him. So that is very real. And then lastly, the congressional advantage that presidents can't really take part in, so to speak, is gerrymandering. And this is a whole other can of worms that, Zach, I know you and I could talk about for the next hour, but we won't on this episode. But I think we will. I'll make sure we set aside time in a future episode to dive into what gerrymandering is and how it has impacted our country because it is messed up. But anyway, the state legislatures can draw the lines for the districts. So oftentimes that can really help a congressional incumbent because they can draw safe districts for that congressman. If you're a Republican and you are running for reelection in a district that has been drawn so 60% of the district votes Republican or are registered Republicans, that's a pretty big advantage. And it goes same with Democrats. I live in a Zach, we were just talking about this before we press record. You live in a highly gerrymandered state in Texas for the Republicans.
Yes.
And I live in a highly gerrymandered state in Maryland for the Democrats.
Yes.
I think we're about 55% Democrat, 45% Republican. 7 of our 8 representatives are Democrat. And I know it's like similar crazy numbers in Texas too, except it's actually like the vote's even closer in Texas now, closer to 50-50. But the representative count in Texas for the Republicans is just crazy.
Yeah, and the state house is also gerrymandered too, and
same
Texas
in Maryland.
is an interesting state because it's a state where actually very few people vote. So this is one of the arguments against gerrymandering is it actually discourages large amounts of the citizenry from voting.
Yep, but we will not. I promise you, we'll not dive into that on this episode because I'm telling you, we could talk forever about it. But one day we will have our own gerrymandering episode so you can understand it a bit better. Zach, anything to add before we hop off from our final election season special on the Incumbency Advantage?
No, I would just say that one of the things that we should just throw in is that traditionally the president of the United States only served 2 terms. That was a norm. And it wasn't until FDR kept running that was changed. And, you could very easily have seen somebody go on to having, 3, 4, 5 terms had that not been changed. And who knows if that's a good thing. I'm not quite sure if that necessarily fits into this. But
Well,
given
yeah.
that there's a presidential election
Sure.
coming up,
Well, I mean, they amended the Constitution so no one could run for more than 2 terms anymore.
yeah, and we don't have term limits for House of Representatives or the Senate. Some people think that's a bad thing. Other people think that's actually a good thing because you want experienced people who understand how the machinery of the state works. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, well,
What's
I have
really
pretty
the best
strong
thing.
opinions on that, but I won't get into it here.
It's funny that there's an age limit to the younger, but there's not an age limit to the elder. I think that would probably be a better thing to do rather than just term limits.
Sure.
That would be my case, but
Interesting. No, I've never thought about that.
because Strom Thurmond is the guy and Robert Byrd, two a Republican and a Democratic senator who had some unsavory comments and poor behavior in the past. To put mildly,
Yeah.
both basically were senators till the very end of their lives, and
Yep,
who knows how with
that's
it
true.
they really were at the end there.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
probably you shouldn't have people in very powerful positions in the country who are just like not with it, but
Yeah.
that's just me.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, man. Let's head out. You ready to go?
Yes, I am.
All right. So thanks for listening, all of you out there who have listened. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.